the moment, I'm reading a book on the history of humanity, and it has a evolutionary and an atheistic basis. And among other things, the writer talks about the myths that have played a part in human development. And amongst those man-made myths, he lists things such as Christianity, the biblical record, and the biblical idea of a creator God. And many times over the years, I've presented evidence to show that the Bible and Christianity and the existence of God are not myths. Instead, there is factual evidence for all of these things. And I've shown again and again that the Bible deals with real people, real places, and real events. And I want to talk about that again today, this time in regard to Babylon, which was mentioned there in the reading. The first reference to the word Babylon is in the Bible is in 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 24. And I'm not going to go there. That was the time when the northern kingdom of Israel was taken into Assyrian captivity around 722 BC. And the Assyrians then took people from other places to populate the land of Israel. There are references back in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 10 and 11 and verse 9 to Babel. And it was there, you might remember, that God confused human languages in order to make people scatter over the face of the earth. And Babel is said to be the site which would, in later years, become Babylon. Around the city of Babylon were established two empires. There's Old Babylon. That relates to the first dynasty of Babylon, which was established by Hammurabi around 1750 BC. And that empire would eventually come under the control of the Assyrians. Then there is the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the New Babylonian Empire. And this occurred after the fall of the Assyrians and lasted from about 612 BC through till 538 BC. And the second king of that empire we're quite familiar with. That's Nebuchadnezzar, whom we read about particularly in the book of Daniel. And so it was that at that time, Babylon and Babylonia became the dominant power. However, that wasn't going to last long. It only lasted for 60 to 74 years, a very short-lived empire. But while it lasted, Babylon was indeed a magnificent city. And you've got a hint of this over in Daniel chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream, and it has to do with the tree that gets chopped down, and Daniel explains it to him. And then some time passes, and we pick it up in Daniel 4 and verse 28. All of this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 12 months later, so 12 months after the dream, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king began speaking and was saying, "Is this not Babylon the great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty?" There's a boasting there, there's a pride there as he looks over this magnificent scene of the city and says, "I did that." And he's going to pay the price for that pride. Let me read to you a couple of descriptions of Babylon. It's hard to get the full appreciation without pictures, though. The first quote: particular efforts were directed towards reconstructing and enlarging the capital city of Babylon, making it the most splendid city in the entire Near East. It was built on both sides of the river Euphrates and surrounded by a double wall of defensive fortifications, which, according to Herodotus, enclosed an area of 200 square miles. Of this, nearly 9/10 or 90% consisted of parks, fields and gardens, and the remainder was occupied by temples, public buildings and private houses. The city walls were lofty and were defended by 250 towers placed at strategic intervals. And if they were evenly placed, then it means that there was one tower every 360 metres. The two portions of the city were intersected in all directions by a network of navigable waterways and canals, so a place of parks, gardens, waterways. A quote from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia: according to Herodotus, the city was surrounded by walls, each side of which was 14 miles long, making the total distance of the walls 56 miles. So in other words, the four walls around the city, each side was just under 22.5 kilometres long. And that means the total city wall was just over 89.5 kilometres. A huge city and a beautiful city. When it comes to Babylon in Old Testament prophecy, two main themes stand out. Number one, God is going to use Babylon to bring judgment upon sinful Judah. But then, number two, God is going to bring judgment upon sinful Babylon. So let's just take the first one of these. God's going to use Babylon to bring judgment on sinful Judah. One of the themes, particularly of the Old Testament, is the fact that God controls nations. And God carries out his purposes amongst nations and cities. And sometimes he uses one nation to bring judgment upon another nation. And you see this through the Bible. God, for instance, used Israel to bring judgment upon the Canaanites. God used various nations to bring judgment on the Israelites during the time of the Judges. God used the Assyrians to bring judgment upon the persistently disobedient people of the northern kingdom of Israel. And God would later use Rome to bring judgment upon Judah and the Jews in the 1st century AD. Now, because of its persistent sinfulness and its refusal to obey God's prophets, God caused the northern kingdom of Israel to go into Assyrian captivity around 722 BC. Unfortunately, the southern kingdom of Judah took no notice of that. They didn't learn from it. And so God then prophesied that he was going to use Babylon to bring judgment upon Judah and take Judah into exile. And you read of that going back to 2 Kings chapter 20 and beginning in verse 16. 2 Kings 20 and verse 16. This is in the time of Hezekiah. Verse 16, then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when everything that is in your house and what your fathers have stored up to this day will be carried to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. and some of your sons who will come from you, whom you will father, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon. What had happened, Hezekiah, the king, had been sick. He recovered from that sickness thanks to God's help, and some people came from Babylon to celebrate the fact that he had recovered. But Hezekiah shows them all around his possessions and the treasury and so forth. And Isaiah says, well, that's where the treasure is going to end up. It's going to end up in the city of Babylon. And that prophecy was made somewhere around 687 BC. So it was only 80 years before that prophecy would start to be fulfilled. So God said he was going to use Babylon to judge the southern kingdom of Judah. But God also prophesied that Babylon itself was going to face judgment. And Habakkuk, the Old Testament prophet, makes comments about this. You've all got e-Bibles, so Habakkuk's fairly easy to find. For me, I've got to remember, so Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk. We'll get there. And this is an interesting, it's short, that's why we call it one of the minor prophets. They're the shorter, but nevertheless, it's quite interesting here. This Habakkuk's ministry is carried out perhaps somewhere around the period between about 625 and 606 BC, so very close to when Babylon begins to attack Jerusalem. And Habakkuk raises a number of issues here. The first one is, God, when are you going to do something about the state of Judah? Because things are really bad. Judah has just sunk into sin. And so we've got this question beginning in Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 5. And this is the prophet speaking. Look among the... this is God speaking here. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit here. Habakkuk has raised the question, God, when are you going to do something? So God gives his reply in Habakkuk 1, beginning in verse 5. Look among the nations, watch, be horrified, be frightened, speechless. For I am accomplishing a work in your days. You would not believe it even if you were told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, and the Chaldeans are the Babylonians, that grim and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to take possession of the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrifying and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Their horses are faster than leopards and quicker than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen charge along. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping down to devour. All of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They gather captives like sand. They make fun of kings, and dignitaries are an object of laughter to them. They laugh at every fortress. They heap up dirt and capture it. Then they fly along like the wind and pass on. And so there is the image here of Babylon sweeping through the cities and the nations, conquering all before them. So God says to Habakkuk, I am going to deal with the sinfulness of Judah. I'm bringing judgment upon Judah through the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. But then Habakkuk raises a second question. Well, hang on. The Babylonians, they're pretty sinful people themselves. So where's the justice in using one sinful people to conquer another sinful people? What about the sinfulness of the Babylonians. Well, God says, I've got that in mind as well. I'll deal with that. We see Habakkuk's argument there in chapter 1, verses 12 and onwards. And then God gives his reply in Habakkuk chapter 2, and verses 2 right through to 20. And I'm not going to take my time to read all of that, but it's talking about the fate of Babylon. And for instance, in chapter 2 and verse 8 of Habakkuk, God says this, and he's speaking to the Babylonians, "Since you have looted many nations, all the rest of the peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all its inhabitants." So Babylon is going to face its judgment day as well. God's not ignoring one sinful people whilst he deals with another sinful people. He is aware of the whole situation and he is dealing with it step by step. Now, as I said, the ministry of Habakkuk occurs maybe 620 BC onwards to, say, 606 BC. But the text that was read to us this morning, that in Isaiah chapter 13, dates, let's say, 80 years earlier. And Isaiah also points to the fact that Babylon is going to face its judgment day. Now, what was going to happen was that the attacks of Babylon upon Jerusalem and Judah were going to take place in three main attacks between 606 BC and 586 BC, so over about a 20-year period. And many of the Jews were going to be taken away into Babylonian captivity. The second king, and the king that gets a lot of attention in the book of Daniel in regard to Babylon, is Nebuchadnezzar. He lives and reigns until 562 BC. And then after his reign, Babylon begins to go into decline. It's a very short-lived empire. The last ruler of Babylon was Nabonidus, who reigned from 556 to 538, 539 BC. And he spent a lot of time away from Babylon, so his son Belshazzar co-reigned in his place from about 553 BC. And you read about Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5. He's the one that sees the finger writing a warning on the wall. In 546 BC, the Persian king Cyrus II gained control of the whole of Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, or which has been called Turkey up until fairly recently. Now, as I've already mentioned, the Medes were incorporated into the Persian kingdom. And so you've got the Medo-Persian forces, and they conquer Babylon in about 538 BC. Now, you get a description here in Isaiah chapter 13, beginning in verse 17. "Behold," says God, "I am going to stir up the Medes against them, who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold." Now, if you go back to chapter 13 and verse 1, you'll see what this chapter is all about, the pronouncement concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. So verse 17, this is God talking about Babylon. He's saying that he will stir up the Medes. The Medes, as I've just said, were incorporated into the Persian Empire. The Medes occupied a huge area to the north and to the east of the Babylonians, and they merged with the Persians, and so they are going to come against the Babylonians, and they will overcome the Babylonians. The Babylonians will fall. Verse 18 of Isaiah 13, and their bows will mow down the young men. They will not even have compassion on the fruit of the womb, nor will their eye pity children. So, Babylon is going to suffer. All of the people are going to suffer. Verse 19, and Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. And you remember that happened way back in the time of Abraham, and those cities were wiped out. And then Babylon would be left to decay, and it would be no more. Chapter 13 and verse 20 of Isaiah, it will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation, nor will the Arab pitch his tent there, nor will shepherds allow their flocks to lie down there. But desert creatures will lie down there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches will also live there, and shaggy goats will frolic there. Hyenas will howl in their fortified towers, and jackals in their luxurious palaces. Her fateful time will also soon come, and her days will not be prolonged. And that was the situation. Not only was Babylon going to fall and be destroyed, but it would never be revived. I'm old enough that I can still remember some sites in London that were left over from German bombing in World War II. These were just vacant blocks. The bombs had dropped, buildings had been wiped out. Now, if you go to London now, it's all these modern buildings and so forth. It's been rebuilt. This was never going to happen to Babylon. Now, what happened was the Medes and the Persians, they were attacking, they were there surrounding the Babylonians in their city. And the Babylonians thought, well, we're invincible. We've got these walls, nothing can happen to us. But the attackers, they saw that the Euphrates River ran under Babylon's walls. And so the attacking forces dug huge ditches to divert, there's a word that I've just invented, to divert the flow of the Euphrates from under the walls. And so whilst the Babylonians were engaged in drunken feasting, the attacking forces, the Medes and the Persians, were able to enter into Babylon and capture the city. And you read about that, just a brief comment in Daniel chapter 5. Initially, the Medes and the Persians, the Persian Empire, treated Babylon with respect, but that turned around. Xerxes I, who reigned from 522 to 486 BC, plundered the city. And by the time Alexander the Great and then the Seleucid rulers that follow after him come along, they can see the city needs reconstruction, but it's going to cost way too much. And so nothing is done about it. Business moves away from Babylon, and so the city is just left to decay. By the time of Jesus' ministry, the site had become a desert. The 1988 edition of Encyclopedia Britannica describes the present site of ancient Babylon to be, and I quote, an extensive field of ruins. And you can go to an encyclopedia and you can see pictures of that site. For instance, the Illustrated Bible Dictionary has an aerial picture of the site in 1980, and it's just barren. All you can see is where archaeological work has gone on, but there's no habitation there or anything else. The prophecy of Isaiah was fulfilled and remains fulfilled to this day. It will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation, nor will the Arab pitch his tent there, nor will the shepherd allow their flocks to lie down there, but desert creatures will lie down there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches will also live there, and shaggy goats will frolic there. Hyenas will howl in their fortified towers, and jackals in their luxurious palaces. Her fateful time soon will come, and her days will not be prolonged. It's just come into my head. I think I read that Baghdad is maybe 60 kilometres away. That, as I said, it's just come back into my head. But nevertheless, the site of Babylon is just barren and is still barren. So Isaiah made his prophecy, and then maybe 80 years later, Habakkuk made his prophecy that this magnificent city would fall and never rise again. And that's exactly what took place. So we have Bible prophecy fulfilled. But there's a problem with that. You know, if the prophecies were all wrong, then people would condemn the Bible and say, well, the prophecies are all wrong. The prophecies are right, so people still condemn the Bible. And they do that because they say the prophecies are too accurate. They couldn't possibly be prophecies. They must be forgeries written after these prophecies allegedly were fulfilled. So in other words, because Babylon fell in 538 BC, then the prophecy was written sometime after that. It wasn't written back in the time of Isaiah. The Bible's full of forgeries. That's their argument. Well, that's not an argument based upon evidence. It's an argument based upon presupposition, which says there cannot be such a thing as prophecy. Therefore, there must be some naturalistic explanation for it. However, we know with the Old Testament that it was written at an early date. For instance, we have what is called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint was a translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into the Greek. And according to the Zondervan Bible Dictionary, it puts the Septuagint somewhere between 280 and 180 BC. There will be some variations between different sources on this. But if you've got a translation written during that time, then the original has to be there before it to be translated. So that tells us that the Old Testament was in fact written earlier. Also, we've got the accuracy of the biblical record. You know, if you go back to ancient writings and read their so-called historical accounts that were written a long time after event, the historical accounts at times are quite dodgy. But you read Old Testament historical accounts, in other words, things in the Old Testament writing of even older things, and you find from archaeology and so forth that it's quite accurate. And so again, this testifies to the early date of Old Testament writing, saying, look, this isn't a late forgery, but rather was written early. Therefore, we do have such a thing as prophecy, and the evidence shows that the prophecies were correct. And I have book after book in my library dealing with the reliability, for instance, of the book of Isaiah and how it was written by Isaiah in completeness. So what's the point to all of this? Well, number one, as I say, you've got the testimony of prophecy. But coming back to my introduction here, I said that the book that I'm reading puts the Bible down as a myth and so forth. Well, the Bible is not a myth. It's not full of myths. Again and again and again, I've shown over the years that the Bible deals with, as I said, real people, real places, real events. You can cross-check the Bible with encyclopedias and find that the Bible is talking about facts, historical facts, geographical facts, biographical facts. And in addition to its historical reliability is its prophetic accuracy as well. And the accuracy of prophecy points to a supernatural origin for the Bible, that it's not just human, because humans do a very poor job of predicting the future. Rather, this was God saying what would happen, and he did so again and again throughout the Bible. So, that raises this question. If God was writing a book about what was going to happen, would it make sense if God got the facts wrong? If God got the biography and the geography and the history all wrong? It wouldn't make any sense. There was a city called Babylon, which from about 612 to 538 BC, a period of around 74 years, was the dominant power in the Near East. But as glorious as that city was, and if you're interested, Google it. If you've got books, look it up in the encyclopedia. There's some magnificent architecture there. The city and its empire, Babylonia, fell to the Medes and the Persians in 538 BC, and thereafter deteriorated until there was nothing left. So the point here is, once again, you can believe the Bible. Therefore, read it. Take a look at it. There's some fascinating stuff in there, particularly in regard to history, but of course there's God's message as well. This is a book that shouldn't just gather dust on our bookshelves. This is a book that we should read and that we should check out and that we should think about and be impressed with the fact that this is indeed the reliable Word of God. And therefore it's a book that needs to be believed and a book that needs to be followed. Let's stand and sing.